3, 2, 1.
Very glad to be in Los Angeles right now as an art major, as an artist.
Today I'm in the London studio of Shaun Gladwell, and nice to see you again, Shaun. But it was probably almost exactly a year to the day that we did the last interview, which was in Venice.
That's right. Okay, nice one.
Yeah. So what's happening here?
I've got a version of Duchamp's 1913 bicycle wheel, but I've done a few little things to it. I can mention these things. These are like pegs that a BMX freestyle rider would use. And BMX freestyle or flatland is like trick bicycle riding. And so what I'm hoping to do is to give this to a very famous BMX flatland rider called Matty Hemmings. He's actually a Welsh rider, really fantastic guy at the top of his field. And we are going to use this artwork with the tyre and the pegs added as a functional object, like a very awkward sort of unicycle. So that's the idea behind the work. But I just like spinning the wheel.
It's funny because apparently that's why Duchamp liked it in the first place.
Yeah, he liked it. I think he described it as like a flickering fire or something.
Yeah, hypnotic like a fire. Yeah,
and I think I've fallen prey to the same hypnosis because it's cool. It's cool to just spin it around, but actually it'll be like this, and this is where I can just break my neck on camera. I'm not actually going to write it, but Matty will kind of.
Oh wow!
Basically, what he's going to do is come into the space, and it'll happen in Torino, like for Artissima. And he's going to add the tyre, which of course wasn't included in Duchamp's original, and then he's going to put these BMX pegs on, and then ride the thing. So yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be fun. But he's probably one of like a few riders in the world that could actually do it, because it's a really difficult thing to ride, and it's really tough. I've got some footage of you of the guys at the bike store testing it out, which is pretty funny. Because I mean,
did they manage to stay on?
Yeah, they're great because they're just used to like balancing on one wheel on bikes, and I do as well, but I'm just not that good to balance on this contraption. This is a really tough deal. So the idea was that it was going to be called the reversed ready-made. You have these industrial objects that of course Duchamp takes and reframes within the institution and questions the status of art, etc., etc. We know the story and the huge legacy that this particular work makes as the first ready-made. But I like the idea that it kind of returns back to utility, that somehow by using Matty and his skills that he can kind of organise himself around this object that we all think as being non-functional or highly dysfunctional, and it becomes a kind of vehicle again.
That's true, because the whole Duchampian thing was about the defunctionalising.
Yeah, and so that process would effectively be reverted or reversed, but I actually like to think that it's the form inverted and then it's turned again, which kind of forms a total revolution because it goes back to utility. And I've got a whole concept running on this, but I don't know if you want to know about it now.
The parafunctional?
Parafunction, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if... it's actually not my term, it's Nikos Papasturgiadis' concept, and I use it all the time, but I think what I need to do is start to make work that's more a clear example of parafunction. So this is probably as close as I've got to something that everyone, as say in the art world, an art student, a collector, or whoever's involved in the art world, they will know this example as being such a famous example of sort of non-functional work. And of course, painting is the same, and he has that whole concept of the assisted ready-made. Uses a Rembrandt as an ironing board, so that plays into it. But the idea of trying to like use something that was always considered useless through its framing within an art institution is going to be fun. And Matty will be quite graceful on it. It's not like he's going to struggle using it. He'll use it with a certain kind of ease, and it's hard to explain it without. Again, maybe we can at this point cut to the video. Yeah. Because I really can't show it to you. I can't. I just don't have the skill.
And when's this happening?
Artissima is on the 7th and 8th, the weekend of the 7th and the 8th November. Right. Yeah, so it's coming up pretty soon. And I'm about to deliver it to the writer so that he has a chance to start to rehearse on it. Yeah. Because I would feel very bad giving this to him a few hours before a gig in front of people. Yeah. That's kind of a little bit too much of a challenge. So yeah, there's a bit of a process involved, but he's already sussed it out, and it's quite cool thinking of people who have just got these strange skill sets that this wouldn't present a problem. That to me is as much fun as the art references, about inverting the useless status of an art object or whatever. Yeah. Cool.
Do you want to tell us about some of the things that you're working on at the moment?
I'm working on a book, but the book is not really a book. It's more of an art book or an artist book, and so it'll be a book. Actually, I have an example of these books. You'll know what they look like, but maybe I could show the book as an example. Basically, the books that I'm obsessed with, that I'm hoping to replicate, are identical to the publisher of these little numbers. So here's Deleuze and Guattari's On the Line. That's like a 15,000 word essay. This is a much bigger one by Paul Virilio, but this is I guess arguably the most famous kind of critical theory or cultural theory essay of the 20th century, I guess. When you start to have people quoted in the Matrix, it's definitely left academia and I guess the reverberations on this so widespread that Baudrillard's probably the king of the Semiotext foreign agent series. So I'm basically going to make a book that's exactly the same as this, but with an essay that I write with Denise Thwaites. So
these books very much dominated art theory in the 1980s, and it's funny actually looking back at the covers because the design looks quite 80s these days with the colours and
that hot font. Pink. Yeah. Well, this actually, I'm just being a bit of a sort of a bibliophile here or whatever, but this is a reprint of the original 80s edition. So this is even almost changing the design to become more 80s than it
originally was.
Right. Yeah, so it's a simulation of itself. MIT Press did all of the subsequent pressings or the editions of the original Foreign Agent series. And that's why Semiotext can claim that they keep everything that they've ever published in print, because it's all print on demand. So I'm going to do a simulation of these books, and I really love the look of them. And actually, when I was an art student in Sydney College of the Arts in the 90s, this was it. This was the... If I wanted to somehow find myself in the middle of discourse, I would have to be referring to information coming out of these books. That the status of the information coming out of this publisher wasn't really rivaled. I don't think, because it was still new in a sense, even though we know that we were at the tail end of it, and it was almost dead and gone, or people had moved on in other parts of the world, but we were in a kind of little enclave that was still hanging on to this theory, and I wasn't aware of that. But I wasn't also aware of the fact that Australia, along with other parts of North America, were also at the forefront of, dealing with translated text. So it's quite a nice history to think that I was experiencing the tail end of it, and whether I like it or not, or if I can admit it, it did influence me. I don't know how much I can admit that, because I'm not even sure to what extent it is. I think some of it is weirdly, you know, it's not really conscious in terms of how I make work, but some of the concepts seeped in, and other times I feel like I learnt them, but I probably just misread them and misunderstood them, and then every now and then I'll have a conversation with someone who does understand these concepts, and they laugh at me, and I think that's quite nice that I'm just like so off the mark with this stuff.
That very much characterised the way that a lot of these theory texts, or the place that they took in art, in the sort of intellectual discourse that surrounded contemporary art in the 80s and late 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, wasn't it? It was, you needed to, in fact, the biggest, I always say this, that the biggest faux pas you could make is by pronouncing the L's in Baudrillard. If you said Baudrillard, that was it, and it was over.
Yeah, you're over, yeah. No, it's kind of like being in America and saying you want to go to Houston Street, not Houston. There's one indicator that the whole facade will just unravel, and it's quite tough, because I think that's interesting that I don't speak French, but if I could just pronounce the French surname of the writer, then I could at least have a chance. But the rest would be up to the translator, and that would be a terrifying position when I think of how complex the texts were in French, and then how you would have to try and organise some semblance of meaning in another language. Like it's beyond me. So, but I do like the idea that I received the text after all of these kind of hops and processes, and then there's the fact that I misunderstand it right at the end of that process. Yeah, I'm like a bad receiver, and so when I regurgitate it, it's such a scrambled signal that whoever was closer to the source, or even someone who was dealing with the translations but understood it on an academic level, I kind of end up becoming almost like an outsider to the concepts that I hold so dear to myself. But
I mean, it is interesting. It's interesting, I think, that you're talking about it in terms of the inside and the outside and levels of initiation. And I mean, because my experience also at Sydney College of the Arts was exactly that. That, there were certain students who got it. They just kind of read it. They were smart. They'd probably had enough context that they kind of got it. There were others like me who would really struggle with these things and really try. And as pieces of writing, they were quite impenetrable, I think.
Yeah, it's almost like this is the one kind of, I guess, area of theory or whatever where you could probably start to there's a suspicion in people who got it easily, in a way, as well. Because you could kind of say to struggle or to see the abstract nature of the text and then be confused by that is also getting it, or that, whatever, as per Derrida, there's always going to be rereadings and every reading is valid, and that's fantastic as a get out of jail free card with this particular kind of discourse. But I did also find it frustrating that there were mature age students or students that came in with a better understanding of what preceded this. Say I didn't have a handle on structural thinking within certain phases of modernism to try and get the post-structural, post-modern phase. I just was basically thrown into the deep end, and it took a little while to work out that there was quite a lot that kind of preceded this that would have helped the understanding of this reading. So, and that probably would have been on a reading list on a beautiful photocopied kind of bulldog stapled kind of little kit that I was given, but I managed to either not read it or misunderstand that was... anyway.
You've probably got it somewhere in a shelf somewhere still, or in a box. Or.
But I just thought the fun thing would be to produce a text that starts to sound like a theory essay based on ideas that I have around Nikos's concept of parafunction. Yeah. If I was to run it like a kind of grand totalizing theory as per 80s kind of postmodern text, then it'd have to be pretty elaborate. Like I couldn't just have this one concept. One term would have to then start coining other terms, like a kind of malignant virus, which is something that I think is really interesting in these texts, is that there's a lot of creative work just in coining terms. And the term becomes an artwork, and the term becomes kind of shareware that people use and refer to, and sometimes even, like, say, in Baudrillard's writing, the term loses any connection with the author, and someone's on the bell, man. What are we going to do? Is that really messy?
No, it's fine, yeah.
It's probably someone trying to delete something. Anyway.
Unless you need to go grab it.
No. Someone else has got to be here to do that, I guess. But but I really love that idea that the terms, I guess, simulacra itself, or the hyperreal, or whatever, I guess Deleuze and Guattari have so many as well. I mean, as you know,
body without organs, and
and then when they get abbreviated to just
BWO,
and then that starts to end up being like this very dense code, and I love that. And I even think the idea that the code becomes impenetrable to anyone but the initiated, that was also a part of this as well. But it was interesting to try and be on the inside of that, or at least keep pace with it somehow.
So how will you actually go about... what will the work actually be, and how will you go about creating the work from?
Well, I mean, I'm going to write the text with Denise, and then we'll package it up. Use a book designer who's in Sydney, Mark Gowing, and we'll just basically replicate the book. And then the only thing that'll be a variation on the book will be that on the colophon page it'll recognise Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation as the publisher. But everything else will look like it came from Semiotext or from MIT Press in collaboration with Semiotext.
So it won't actually be... Because initially I think the SCAF project was going to be an exhibition, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, this will just be one work in...
Oh, part of it, right, okay.
Yeah, so this will be one work in... there'll be like an array of works, 3 video works, 1 kinetic sculpture, and then this book. But I consider the book... It's like a Magrittean thing. I got really interested in some of the authors that were associated with Semiotext, but then were also just public intellectuals or academic rock stars like Michel Foucault or whatever. And when he wrote this text on Magritte, it was fantastic. He was talking about Magritte unravelling this calligram between objects and language. And I thought, this is great, because here I am producing a book, but I can also say in a kind of Magrittean way, this is not a book, it's an artwork. Because it's a book as soon as it leaves the show, but in the show I'm going to call it Self-Portrait as a Semiotext Foreign Agent. But that title won't be actually in the book. So as soon as the book leaves the exhibition, it'll just be called whatever, parafunction or whatever. So, I mean, people probably won't give a fuck, but I'm just thinking that for me is kind of interesting, that the book will have a title outside of the book itself. Usually the book is some self-contained unit where it titles itself and the information is in there to be accessed, but this will be a different kind of experiment. Often,
particularly in the context of art, often things that are simulations of something particularly historical, and here you're talking about books that were around 20, 25 years ago, tend to come from a position of irony. But it sounds with this project that there actually isn't really any irony. It's more about capturing something.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
I think there's got to be it's got to be several parts. There's got to be irony in there at some point, because I do like the idea that it's a play on the design. But then there's a kind of homage to the. I tried to make that as French as possible, saying homage.
That's good.
Homage, and I just because I do remember fetishizing the books.
Yeah.
Like, I remember loving because the guy who designed the cover was also one of the editors of Semiotext, Jim Fleming, and I love the idea that this whole concept of being on the inside and understanding the theory through beating yourself with this text and trying to get the language, there's a kind of whole concept of a foreign agent, like the French theorist. Is an agent who comes into another scene or environment and then starts to impart this knowledge through this publisher. It's kind of great to think that there's this information that's coming to us, this current theory But then there's also this kind of microfiche reference, like that it's it's accessible to those who could care or whatever. But then they were actually also hard to get at the time. I remember that a lot of them were hard to buy. I just think I'm just thinking of the time before Amazon Prime, and I can't. It's really hard to try and get my pre-internet thinking around the idea of trying to access text. And also there was like as you know, there was like an aesthetic around text. Like a lot of them weren't in these beautifully packaged volumes; they were photocopied.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And so the Xerox was like a whole aesthetic. And I remember reading
photocopies of photocopies of photocopies.
Yeah.
Which is ironic when you're thinking about Baudrillard.
Well, yeah, he was nailing it really. And even you kind of think of like I guess art and language, and you have the Xerox book as a work that comes out of that. Where you just have our the image of nothing just being sort of somehow forming just through the photocopier itself. So Ian Byrne, like it's quite nice to think that all of this additional visual information was either added to those texts or reduced or removed from them just through photocopies, which was the only way we could get the text. And these books were great because this is just really geeky stuff, isn't it? You could get an A4 out of a double page.
Yes.
Which was awesome. And I'm sure that Silveri, the guy who was editing Semiotext, was aware of that. I'm sure that the volume was actually proportioned so that you could get a double-page photocopy out of a flatbed Xerox in one A4. Perfect. Or a US letter if it was over there. So and also it was kind of like a Mao little red book. It's mobile. It has
it's kind of pocket size.
Subversion. And then you have other people who start to replicate this, like a lot of artists were also publishing in this format. The idea that it's
and in fact, you know what? Art and Text as a publisher, because I used to work for them about 20 years ago, had a branch of Art and Press called Empress, and they also used to publish books very, very similar size as well, which were these very small kind of theoretical,
Well, I think it was about this idea that theory wasn't some sort of like recalcitrant thing that got stuck in academia, that it was mobile, that you had this book that was present with you, that you would travel with, or that, but it was kind of like a metaphor for the idea that it was high theory, but then it was dealing with popular cultural, mass cultural phenomena, or, I'm over-theorizing now, maybe.
But it's interesting, actually, that you mentioned that, because I was just thinking about the zombie book that, very, very similar.
Yeah. And so, you have...
And that was Routledge, wasn't it? This publishing that series.
Shortcuts series
Yeah.
or whatever. And, I just think that, from my memory, this is the first time that I was experiencing a small, almost like a chapbook of theory. And it started to... We were talking about the idea that there was a poetic sensibility to it, that you're supposed to get into this pleasure of the text or whatever, but they reminded me of poetry chapbooks. That you get this like thin volume of poetry, and that you would reread it, or you would take it and carry it with you. And it was the same with these. If I was lucky enough to get one in Sydney in the 90s, I would sort of start to dog-ear the pages, and they'd start to get beaten up, and I'd start to get some sort of weird relationship, sick relationship with this book. And now I get a chance to, bring up my own version, my own kind of hack version, The interesting thing I think about, because thinking about your work more broadly, is that quite often your studio work doesn't take a easily identifiable position on things. In fact, quite often it will retreat from doing that, even when you yourself, as a person will have, particular, for instance, the war artwork, you'll have particular kind of positions, but that's not necessarily articulated through your work. This, on the other hand, seems to actually
state very clearly something that has been actually for quite a few years an underlying concern of yours, probably a developing concern, which is this idea of parafunctionality. So was there need to explain that notion?
Yeah, I guess that maybe it became obvious that I wasn't going to let the term go. That when the first place I heard it was actually here. Nikos came and did a lecture series. Well, actually, I even think it was just one guest lecture at Goldsmiths. And so here I was listening to an Australian theorist at Goldsmiths whilst I was here on a scholarship, and a few terms that he mentioned in association with ruins and repurposing urban space really sounded interesting to me. Stuff that I felt like I could work on, or even that I'd been working on already without having a term to sort of guide me. And parafunction was just such a great term because I thought, wow, he was thinking about the way that artists would say reuse or repurpose post-industrial space in cities wherever they were in the world, and that was a part of modernism, that you would have artists that were accessing the centre of cities at that moment where they could through an economic sort of slump, or that they were positioned through those processes, and that they had the ability to rewire architecture and space through what they were doing. And that also informed their work, the scale of those spaces. So he was kind of thinking through a very particular kind of way, and parafunction was his term. But I was thinking, well, that's also what skateboarders were doing, or that's what like a lot of urban activity was doing, that even without the idea of a disused space being activated, it could be a form or a space or even an idea, I guess, which I'll explore in this book, that can be projected onto, that someone else's concerns or designs or activity can project onto something that may have had a completely different design or was intended for other uses. So my example is that like when a skateboarder uses a handrail, that's a great example of parafunction for me. Whether the handrail is in a disused part of a city or whatever, or if it's in a very busy urban space or civic space, that it's of no consequence, that it's the skateboarder projecting their own function onto the design of a handrail, and even inverting that, because the handrail is there to try and stabilise some bipedal human being, and it's really for safety, where the skateboarder is using it for an extremely dangerous activity. And I love the idea that it's a complete inversion. And also Dick Hebdige in Subculture, The Meaning of Style, which was also a very beautiful little book, was also talking about this idea of and I think I've even talked about this before. I keep regurgitating the same example.
It shows you're consistent.
Yeah, consistency. Well, that's a cool concept as well. Deleuze has an idea that the idea has to have consistency or whatever. But yeah, the safety pin in the punk's nose is great, because the safety pin is designed for baby diapers. You don't want to stab yourself. But the punk putting it through their nose is great, because it's a complete disregard for that intended design. So maybe this is a different kind of function. In the essay, I'll start to look at what function means in terms of the designer, and then the kind of death of the designer through parafunction. And then there's a third function, which I'm going to call patafunction, which is where function starts to operate in objects that had kind of removed themselves strategically from function, and that these objects are entered back into utility. I'm kind of talking about function in relation to utility, because of course we can talk about...
Which is, with this work over here, that's pretty much what you're doing, isn't it?
Yeah, but I should specify that, because function... Baudrillard wrote a really great essay in '68 called The System of Objects, where he talks about schizofunction and metafunction. Obviously we talk about that work of Duchamp's functioning still. It has symbolic function, and function never ceases. But I do like the idea that when I start to align function with utility, then that's when I start having fun with terms like Nikos's parafunction and this other term that I'm going to try and justify, which is also a very 80s thing to do, to get a term and then you kind of start to couch the term in examples, or you start to support it, and then somehow you try and launch the term, and if it gets traction or currency, then the term can then go on and do its own thing and be used or creatively misused, and even ideas operate within function, parafunction, patafunction. I just like the idea that I'm starting to set up a very useless system for myself that'll be, hermetically sealed. It'll be relevant to no one eventually. No one will care about the book. It'll be published in about 1,500 copies, which is one of the original runs of a foreign agent. And even Semiotext, when they first published these, found the uptake slow, which is ironic considering what happened to the publisher and the status. But I can imagine I will not have that other side of the story. There'll be no uptake. There'll be a lot of remaindered copies. But I'm an artist, so I can exhibit those remaindered copies. See, they just become material for the next project.
Well, it just becomes a limited edition.
Or it becomes sort of capitalising on your own failure. That's another way of looking at it.
Does the, because the idea of parafunctionality to me seems to, the way you've talked about it here and also previously.
Can I just, just turn it into an install there. Sorry.
Isn't it amazing to get a drone model kit?
Well, there's the relationship there.
Pure war, yeah.
Sorry, actually all of them are relevant. They kind of weirdly fit, so anyway.
So do you think that the book in itself, given that its content is about parafunctionality, there's something actually in its form that deals with that?
Yeah.
It's articulated in its form.
I think for me to come and run a simulacra on one of the books is definitely me pushing my function onto that form. So already it starts to perform its own it starts to perform within the universe that it critiques or whatever. Fuck. That sounded pretty spot on.
You should write that down.
Jeepers, yeah, that's material for the book.
That's in the introduction.
Yeah, but actually also I will write it with Denise, who is much more qualified than I. And I do also like the idea that there's this notion of outsourcing involved. Because there's only so much I can do with a theory essay. Someone like yourself or Denise or an academic wouldn't have any problem, but for me I would probably take years that it would take for Denise to do the research that I'm asking myself. And it becomes more interesting for me, even in terms of looking at models of authorship for us to work on it. And it's a very 80s debate, as per Bart. It's got to cover all angles. I can't just write the book.
You could do a sequel that really sort of takes on the kind of the Kuhn's approach and completely outsource the authorship of the intellectual content.
I would love it. I'm still kind of strangely attached to my own ideas, but I think to take it to the ultimate sort of simulacra would be for it to be completely ghostwritten, absolutely. That I would have absolutely no relationship to the book except for nominating it as an artwork and maybe setting up the conditions for its production. That would be, a serious commitment to the idea of removing myself as an author and art. But I'll probably just meet that idea halfway in some sort of compromised state where I come up with some sort of framework, and Denise is then going to kind of improvise on some, almost like a jazz structure or something. We'll work out a way where we're writing together, but it all gets filtered through her actual language. That's probably and some of the books are amazing. Like when you read, say, 1,000 Plateaus or whatever, it's kind of amazing. Some people claim, people like probably Brian Masumi will know which one is writing, who came up with the idea, Deleuze or Guattari. It becomes really specific, but then for me, I will just see it as this beautiful, seamless form that doesn't offer any transition other than the ones that it's describing itself. Do you know what I mean? And that interests me. It's like their collaboration was so tight. It's extraordinary. But then there's others who will be on the inside and know what that process was exactly. And that fascinates me, that there's no I'm still very much a novice in this process, and that's why it's good to get on the phone to the experts.
And Denise is actually based in Sydney, so you're doing this pretty much by email.
Yeah, which is good because I even like the idea that it happens through, say, Google Docs, or it happens through Dropbox, and that my fantasy is that you have several authors writing texts, almost like computer programmers writing code. And I just love that whole, and that's such an 80s.
But it's such a contemporary thing as well, because it's like, you know, it's kind of a crowdsourcing of a theory.
Yeah, sure, which is great. I think I'd like to do more of it.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of crowdsource intellectual labour and then author it as my own.
Maybe that's volume 2.
No. Actually, there's no. It doesn't. It's of no consequence who authors it in the end. I mean, it could easily just be a pseudonym or whatever. That's fine as well. Like, and in fact, I love writing from, say, the Anonymous Committee, or people like Hakim Bey who were writing around pseudonyms, or they were completely anonymous. I'm interested in that as well. So yeah, but the idea of ghostwriters having this kind of interesting relationship to like the official author is great. It happens within obviously sports autobiographies all the time, because you know, some of my favourite athletes, they're not that comfortable writing about their own story.
Yeah.
So I just love this idea of someone sitting next to them, trying to help them articulate their memories and experiences.
Whilst also trying to maintain the voice that is convincingly still the agency of the person.
And that, I mean, already it's compromised, because it's never going to be a centralised I author. It's already a displaced process. So how it's kind of almost like the farce of it all is interesting. You know, and there's a really great essay on that David Foster Wallace writes about one of his teen idols, this female tennis player who he just adored and had this kind of huge obsession with, and then he goes and reads their autobiography and is just crushed. And he almost hopes that process was intellectually outsourced or whatever. And I just think I just know my limits, and it's certainly more interesting for me to just come up with a couple of ideas and see if they're elaborated on or forgotten or whatever through someone else's writing, which will be much better than mine. But then, you know, maybe I can sneak a few sentences in there through that Google Docs that someone didn't edit. That would be great. So I can say that I actually put brush to canvas, and some of my, you know, presence was still there. If not, who cares? Yeah.
And when is this targeted for publication?
The show opens in March next year. So, you know, these things are nasty little chunks of wood. They can be published anywhere, but they still need a bit of time. So I guess we'll have to get it in. But what I like about it is that, you know, it's just going to be one artwork in a series of artworks. Another one is like an aircraft passenger chair under a kind of waterfall. And another work is like a video of people performing in an automatic car wash. So there's all these kind of connections, but all the works are sort of somehow reinforced or summarised in the book. It does operate as a totally elaborate, out-of-hand sort of concept statement, I guess.
So it functions, it kind of has an exegetical function, as we'd like to say in academia. It's like an exegesis for the work to some extent.
It's extremely coded, though. It's not going to announce itself as such. So if and also it'll have to somehow break its own logic. So if there is an exegesis, it'll at some point have to turn or fold or whatever. It's really hard not to use the language, and I'm not using the language correctly as well. That's the other thing. I will hear a term that comes through one of these texts, or even when it's in the, even better when it's in the kind of phonos. You know, someone's doing it through a lecture. That's when I can really misunderstand it, because I'm not getting it through the logocentric reception, which I think goes in deeper. You know, there's a whole Derridean thing on this stuff. it's when when it would come through a lecture, like say when I hear Nikos talk about his stuff, and I make a note, the note's incorrect, I go back and elaborate on this misunderstanding, and then we're away. We're into like, outsider theory, really uninformed theorizing. So,
oh look, I think creative misunderstandings of ideas is very fruitful. I mean, my own PhD thesis was full of them.
Yeah, well, I just think, to be true to the ideas that I'm working on with, say, urban activity, like the skateboarder can both see the handrail for what it is, but then they also have to misunderstand it in order to do what they do. So in a way, there is a kind of parody to the writing process and what the subject matter of some of the stuff will be. So we'll just see how it goes. It could be an epic failure, and they'll still look great as objects. I
think what it does, when you talked about it then, I was thinking about my earlier question about irony, and I think that what you are doing is a different position from simple conformity or straightforward irony, and it is about that approach in itself it has some kind of resonance with this parafunctional idea, I think, because it's neither one nor the other.
Yeah, well, I guess the term itself has to find some clear space against an ironic use of an object, and then it can't just somehow invert the object for its own sake. And then it's also going to be trying to inhabit that space, which is also full of other accurate, meaningful terms like free play or becoming, or there's so many other terms within this discourse that could easily describe. If I was to catenate all of those terms, I could probably nail what I'm trying to say, but I want to fast track with parafunction. And it's also an experiment. Can it ever have currency outside of my own interest? Because artist writing is almost like, who has time to read anymore anyway? And then you kind of think, well, when an artist writes, they've already sort of started to bracket down their readership to probably other artists who are freaked out that someone just bought a book about their colleagues, or a curator, or an art academic, and the general public who are readers won't be very interested in artist writing unless posterity judges that artist writing is fantastic, you know what I mean? So it's very, say, people who are writing now, like people like Paul Chan or Liam Gillick, I'm interested in their writing because they're under no obligation to make sense, and they also know that they've got a very limited readership. They're not, they don't have the hubris thinking that they're going to crack a bestseller, although Gillick, maybe, I don't know, he's Waiting for Erasmus is pretty good as a novel, but I think that the genre is really it's almost kind of ridiculous and very obscure. So it kind of knows itself as being a really obscure, random thing. But anyone's welcome to order one off the SCAF website. Yeah. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Thank you, Shaun. It was a pleasure hearing you talk about what will the title be?
Drone MQ9. It's yet to be decided. I'm not really sure. I think I'm going to call it something really romantic, like the Lacrima chair, which is one of the names of the works, and it's crying chair.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be really romantic and sorrowful and stuff. That's the angle I'm going for.
Well, you've got to go for that, French poetic kind of approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. Why shy away? Yeah. Great.
Okay. Thanks a lot.